Hello everyone, I hope you're well and staying out of harm's way. I missed our class. I wanted to give you a lecture, however, on W.D. Ross before the exam. We looked at non-consequentialist thinking with utilitarianism, deontology, non-consequentialist, and consequentialist thinking with utilitarianism. And W.D. Ross is neither one of the above. He has problems with the utilitarianism of Bentham and Mill, and he also has problems with Kant, his deontology. So let's get right to it. In a little book he wrote called The Right and the Good in 1931, Ross, who's a British philosopher, lived from 1877 to 1971. I suppose we can label him an intuitionist, and that's revealing. He thinks that, as in the case of mathematics, we can apply intuition in ethics to decide what the right thing is to do. And he uses the example in his book, which is not a very long book. He says, I just look at 5 and I know that it's greater than 3. I don't have to think much about it. I don't have to count matchsticks, 5 matchsticks versus 3. I just see it in a flash. In fact, that's what intuition is known to be, an immediate apprehension of truth. So why Ross? How does he fit in here? Well, Ross, instead of having one locution for what our obligations are, like deontology says I must apply the categorical imperatives, act always such the maximum of your action can be in rest lies, or the one formula of utilitarianism, act so as to increase the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Sometimes there's some variation on that, some slight increased general well-being and so forth, but it means roughly the same thing. Ross thinks that none of those formulas by themselves are sufficient. In fact, there are cases where one rule will not do, and this is why he says the faculty of intuition may come into play in these kinds of examples. So instead of having one duty, as I started to say, or one formula for what good is, you'll notice in the short article that Ross has 7 duties, and he divides these into what he calls prima facie duties. It's a little Latin phrase meaning first glance, things that are duties at first glance. And then he calls the other ones duties proper, or our actual duties. So there's duties proper, our actual duties. So prima facie duties are not only duties at first glance, like the duty to tell the truth, for example, but they're conditional duties, meaning that they're not absolute. They may be a duty in a given circumstance, but that duty may get overthrown by a greater duty that comes into play. The one that you finally go with, the duty that supplants, let's say, the conditional duty, that's your actual duty. So, similar, typical kind of example, you make a promise with someone because you're good at physics, you're going to help that person with their physics homework. And you make the promise to tutor them, let's say, at Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. And you're ready to, because you've made a promise, that obligates you. Ross would believe that, Kant would believe that, I think the utilitarians would believe that. But what happens is on the way to the tutorial, you encounter an accident. There's a roadside accident. And if you were to stop and render aid, you could be of great use, maybe save a person's life, be the first person to make a call. In any case, Ross would say now there's a conflict of duties situation, notice. You had a duty to continue on and to go to the tutorial on time and to help the friend. But now a new duty has come along, a new prima facie duty, the duty to help others. That's on his list of 7, the duty of benevolence. So he thinks in this case, the latter duty, the duty of benevolence, supplants the former duty, the duty of keeping the promise. He thinks that it has the greater duty, and you can, by intuition, recognize that it's the greater of the 2 duties. This is why he doesn't want to keep to a hard and fast list. Life is rich, circumstances are varied that they can arise, and so the best we can do, he says, is with probabilities we can make some inference about what our duties are, but these are not absolute. And so his list of 7, which has, the first duty is to keep promises, or he calls it a duty of fidelity, not fidelity in the marital sense of fidelity only, but duty in the sense of keeping a promise. He lists that first, but he makes no arguments for it. He just thinks that that's the most important of the duties. But that duty, as we just saw, the duty can be supplanted by a duty, one of the 7 duties further down the list. I think that's kind of interesting. So, now what problems would Ross have with utilitarianism? Well, let's say he talks about G.E. Moore, George Edward Moore, and Hastings Rashval, two other British philosophers in the article, and he says they always believe that the obligation, he calls it ideal utilitarianism, their version of utilitarianism, is to do that action which will produce the greatest amount of duty, or the greatest amount of good results. He doesn't go with that. He thinks that the common man, as he puts it, sometimes people say the man in the street, doesn't believe that either. You wouldn't just break any promise to a person to whom you have no promise. So if you have a promise to a parent or a friend, let's say, and you could break that promise and benefit 3 other people, right? You owe them some money and you have to pay it by the 15th of the month. But if you break that promise and and help 3 other people by dividing the $1,000 up that you owe, then you give $333.33 each. You may satisfy more people, but Ross would say, I have no duties to them because I've made no promises to them. So he says the value of a promise depends upon who you made it to. I think this is refreshing, because some people think that the obligation of all morals is to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Ross would not think so. You can't just go breaking any promise. I sent you the example of the deathbed promise made by the niece to the aunt. The aunt wants the $6 million in her will to be given to the New York Yankees because the Yankees have always given her pleasure. The niece, on the way out after the aunt dies, thinks of, I can spread the wealth and spread the $6 million among these deserving charities, A through F. But the Ross, I think, would say, no, you should not break the promise. You have no obligation here to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And the act of promising, as he says ordinary people would think, should be honored. This is a solemn promise made to not just anyone, but your aunt, who on her deathbed asked you to do this for her. The second problem that Ross has is with deontological thinking, or Kant. He makes a remark in passing in the article. He says it may be the case that no one in the history of Western philosophy, save Immanuel Kant, thinks that it's always wrong to tell a lie. That's not a compliment. Kant does think that. The categorical imperative says, I must lie to the person who comes to my front door, remember, who thinks that, who's asked where his friend is, and if his friend is hiding in the house, then I have to tell him where he is. So there's no exception to this universal obligation. I can't universalize a maxim to break a promise. Ross thinks otherwise, that kind of a duty, keeping a promise, which obviously he holds high regard for, he ranks it number 1 in his own ranking of 7, as I've said, that can be supplanted by a greater duty to come along. So if there's a conflict of duties, and I think Ross is better set up in his philosophy, being a pluralist, acknowledging more than one duty, he is better prepared, better set up to handle conflicts of duty situations, better than utilitarians, and better than Kant. This is interesting because most people would say Ross is not the equivalent as a philosopher of Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, or Immanuel Kant. I would agree with that. But that in this case, anybody can make a great point. But Ross is a kind of mid-level philosopher of the 20th century. But in this case, in conflict of duty situations, I have a duty, let's say, to save a life. The person hiding in my house who's now being besieged by the man at the door with a knife or the gun. Or the duty to tell the truth. If I raise those 2 duties up, one will rise above the other, Ross says. The duty in this case is to benevolence, that ranks lower on his list. The duty to save a life in this case far ranks the duty to tell the truth. So he's not a formalist. He does not believe in keeping the form of the moral law, as Kant would. So rules can be broken. It's that old saw, rules are meant to be broken. And so in this case, that's sometimes the case, and it's certainly the case here. So if you were to take Ross, you're hiding out Anne Frank in Amsterdam from the Nazis, or some of the other groups religious groups that hid Jews from the Nazis. You're hiding Anne in the building there, and when the Nazis come to the front door and ask, "Are you hiding Jews here?" You don't say, "Yes, 3rd floor." That would be telling the truth, but you would also be costing lives. And so the greater of the two duties there is to save a life, not to be so frank as to, not to be honest in this case, as to, make a statement that will cost people their lives. So Ross's intuitionism is really fresh air. It gives a way to cut through philosophical problems, and by acknowledging, you'll have to look at his list of 7 duties there. He has duties of self-regard, duties of benevolence, duties of non-malfeasance, duties to do no harm, they're tradable. Any one of these prima facie duties can be canceled by a greater duty that comes along, or so he thinks. So I think that's what I have to say about Ross, and I hope that helps you. And I will hope you look at this and learn from it for tomorrow's exam. Thank you. Have a good day.